So, just before I get into this one related to this subject about this year's presidential election, which is now, let's see, 17th of October, probably 3 weeks away, just over 4 weeks away. Um, One thing to say about that, the polls, I've actually got to the point where I'm starting to disregard them because honestly, every day we hear about a new poll where Harris is in the lead or it's dead tied, or I just think that. We know from history that polls can be wrong, and in the swing states this year, it does seem to be really neck and neck. So as someone who really, really wants Harris to win, I'm not going to invest too much hope in the polls. It's worth mentioning in 1948, it was widely, the press widely reported that Dewey had won and Harry Truman had actually won the election. So he famously held up a newspaper report. I think it was the Chicago Tribune, if I've got that right, saying Dewey becomes president, wins election, and of course that was wrong. I think I see like thumbnail clips saying massive new lead for Harris. I just don't. It's not so much that I don't believe it. It's just that I think it's really, really subject to change. So I've just read a piece in The Economist from May. This edition of The Economist is America dictator-proof, and it's an interesting piece. It starts off by talking about how when America was founded, the founding fathers speculated on what the title of the president should be. John Adams apparently proposed His Elective Majesty or His Mightiness, which sounds almost, John Adams, of course, had some controversy as a president over, I believe it was called the Alien and Sedition Act. Um, he was seen as more autocratic than Washington. In the end, Washington settled for the simple Mr. President. Of course, Washington, one reason he's so highly regarded as a president is because he set the precedent for the peaceful handover of power. Um, it's interesting though because as we've seen the presidency get more and more powerful as an office in that time, and this is what the piece mentions, there's only been two major constraints on presidential power, or not even constraints. There's only been two constitutional amendments regarding this. The 22nd Amendment, which is that a vice president takes over if the Congress decides the president is incapacitated. Excuse me, that's the 25th Amendment. The 22nd Amendment is that no president can serve more than 2 terms. That was a response to Franklin Roosevelt controversially getting 4 terms. He died, of course, into his fourth term. Watched an interesting documentary actually on Roosevelt recently. That is the second Roosevelt. Um, with Donald Trump, I don't think that anything is normal because I don't think he's really. I'm fairly well studied with the American presidency, and I don't think anyone is comparable to Donald Trump. Sometimes names are thrown out, like the populism of Andrew Jackson or Ronald Reagan or the corruption of Richard Nixon. But I do think Donald Trump is unique. I think he's uniquely bad. Um, I'll be making another video soon on presidential rankings because I find that an interesting thing. But there's interesting things raised in this article. Talks about how America in the 20th century set up parliamentary systems that have been foolproof parliamentary systems, such as in Italy, Japan, and the other example they gave was Iraq. Iraq maybe not as much of a good example as Italy and Japan, but anyway, it also says that American style systems have been set up in countries like the Philippines and Latin America, which were not dictator proof. In the case of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos and his martial law era throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But there's also an accompanying video with The Economist. What will Trump do if he loses the US election? I think this was made more recently. I'll touch on that in a second, but I just want to close with, or I just want to touch on their closing piece, which I only partly agree with. Here we go. If I could just get this, I'm just quoting, I should say the Economist doesn't byline the journalist, it doesn't quote who's writing the individual articles. And yet scholars of democratic decline, thanks to the 45th president, a booming field, point out that the most dangerous moments of government by the people are during a crisis, when which a president may exploit to seize extraordinary powers and not let them go. When faced with two such crises during his presidency, COVID-19 and nationwide protests after Mr. Floyd's murder, protests which turned violent, I might add, Mr. Trump retreated into commentator mode, pointing out what a poor job everyone else was doing. Even his worst acts as president, such as the pressure on Georgia's Secretary of State to stuff ballot boxes on his behalf, were more improvised chaos and cunning subversion. I'll come back to that point. He wondered out loud about shooting protesters in 2020, but didn't do so. A more disciplined despot in waiting or a more malignant version of Mr. Trump, however, would have ample scope to subvert America's democracy. Partially by design, America is not dictator-proof. That's how they conclude it. I only partly agree with that. Well, I don't like the language of calling those violent riots in 2020 protests. I take a very strong view on that. I think riots are riots. This is often the thing that's made in defense of Trump, that when the opportunity actually arises, he doesn't go into full dictatorial mode, i.e. he didn't do that sort of break glass thing of shooting protesters or shooting rioters, I might say. But what I don't agree with, though, is even his worst acts as president, such as the pressure on Georgia's Secretary of State to stuff ballot boxes on his behalf, were more improvised chaos and cunning subversion. I'm not sure about that. Maybe it was just Trump being Trump, i.e. very erratic, which itself should disqualify him from the White House. But for a president of the United States, he was still president at that point, November 2020, to actually try to pressure a state official to rig an election on his behalf. It may be Trump's erraticism, but what I don't agree with is just to dismiss that as such. I mean, that is no small thing. I do agree with the conclusion, though, America is not dictator-proof. Now, the role of the presidency has got a lot more powerful over time. If we look at the late 19th century, this report doesn't mention it, but I'm mentioning it. The most powerful people in America were not the presidents. You know, between Lincoln and the first Roosevelt, the presidency was relatively weak. I mean, really, who remembers Rutherford B. Hayes or Benjamin Harrison or even two-term Grover Cleveland? McKinley kind of brought back a bit more power to the White House, but in those days, the real power lay with the tycoons, people like Nicholas Vanderbilt and Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. That was where the huge power in America lay. Despite Lincoln's assassination, there wasn't even major security detail around presidents, so that's telling. But the video that I've just watched, it was made more recently. What will Trump do if he loses? I think just as poignant a question will be, what will he do if he wins? I think he's more bitter than before. He's older. He's 78. And, you know, his age shows sometimes. But I think Trump's bitter. He has said that he'll go out for revenge effectively. I think there should be just as many questions about what happens if he wins. Because even though Harris has led many polls, those of us who want her to win cannot be complacent. Trump might still win this. He might win the Electoral College. The Democrats should respond. I think they would have a right to angrily protest how flawed a system that is, but not get into violence. You know, that would be obviously not the way forward. But I do think the Democrats would have a right to really, really raise questions, because for the third time in the 21st century, they will be on the poor end of the unfairness of that system. I mean, let's say there's a scenario where Harris gets more votes, but she loses the Electoral College. That is just fundamentally undemocratic. And I think they would have a right to really make a thing of it. I don't mean any sort of violence, certainly. I'm not advocating for a Democrat version of January the 6th, but I do think that would be I think it's undemocratic, and it's the Democratic Party that has lost out. I mean, this is something that Trump supporters need to explain. If the Democrats are so dictatorial, why is it that Al Gore and Hillary Clinton didn't, stage some sort of coup when they thought that they had been treated unfairly in those respective elections? Never happened. Um, but I don't think there'll be a repeat of what happened on January the 6th, 2021. I think it's extremely unlikely that we'll see that again because there's going to be huge security. But we may see some sort of attempts to undermine democracy at a local level. Trump might try to, get local infiltration going on. In Nebraska, they're trying to gerrymander the system there so that the one electoral, I think in the state of Nebraska, it's not a winner take all situation, something like that. Republicans in that state are trying to make it so that it is, because of course it's a Republican state. Um, I think that, I don't know, there's just so much unpredictability when it comes to Trump. I mean, how much of it is just hot air and how much of it would he actually go through with? I do think he's a wannabe dictator. I think he admires dictators. I don't think America is going to be a dictatorship in the sense of Trump having absolute power. I do think there is enough strength in the democratic institutions to prevent that, and I do think there's enough opposition in American society. American police are mostly tied to state level, not federal level, so there are certain checks and balances that would prevent Trump being a total dictator, but I certainly think he might try. I don't think that Project 2025 should be dismissed. Um, But either way, it's a problem. If it's a close election and Harris wins, Trump will kick up a stink. If he wins, what sort of form is his revenge going to take? And even if he doesn't take revenge on domestic opponents, his threats towards NATO shouldn't be dismissed. John Bolton says that's not a bluff. Um, I don't know. With Trump, everything is, I will be so pleased when this man is consigned to electoral history. Hopefully, 4 years from now, Trump is a footnote. He is no longer in the conversation. But we'll find out in a few weeks. Anyway, it's an interesting article in the Economist. Is America dictator proof? They conclude that it's not.